Hello everyone. In this video I would like to begin talking about a new subject, and this new subject is software reuse, code reuse essentially. It of course takes us time and effort to write code that actually works in our PHP scripts, so anything that we can potentially do to get more mileage, to get more use out of any code that we've already written and tested and debugged is certainly a worthwhile thing to do. If you think about it in terms of time is money, then you could say that being able to reuse code that we've written previously saves us money because it saves us time. So it's cheaper to do software development when code can be reused. That makes sense in a lot of different ways. If you imagine using PHP to create one website, and during the creation of that website, of course, a lot of code is written. Well, what happens next week or next month or next year when I move on and I write another project? Odds are that new project is probably going to have some similarities to the one that I've already completed. So if there's any code that I could reuse from the first project to the second, that would be an obvious time savings. And that time savings would mean the project could be done quicker, more projects could be packed into a smaller amount of time, everything I do would be more consistent and be more reliable. There's just really no downsides when it comes to reusing code. Reusing code is overall just a wonderful thing to be able to do. It's something that you should pretty much always be thinking about on one level or another, something you should always be striving for. PHP provides us with a couple of different ways that we can potentially reuse code. One of them is one that you've hopefully already been familiar with from previous programming experience, JavaScript if nothing else. This form of software reuse is in the form of what we call functions. A function is simply a collection of statements, basically a collection of PHP statements that perform some task, get some job done, that we bundle together so that those statements are stored together. They can be moved from project to project or page to page together and can simply be called on anytime that they happen to be needed. Functions in PHP are written very much sort of in the style of functions in JavaScript. Functions in PHP start off with the keyword function followed by the function's actual name, whatever you may want that name to be. The function's name is then followed by a set of parentheses. The parentheses will be used to hold variables. Those variables are then used to hold values that are provided to the function when the function is called, essentially information that the function may need to be able to perform its job. Those parentheses are then followed by a set of curly braces. The curly braces hold the function body. All of the different statements that actually make up whatever it is that the function does are put inside those curly braces. Here is an example. Instead of creating a function called name, I'm going to create a function called say hello. So say hello will be the name of my function, and for right now, kind of starting off simply, I'm going to set this function up so all it does is echo the string hello followed by a break. If I go ahead and pull that particular page up in my browser at this point, when I refresh the page, you can see that hello shows up exactly nowhere. Of course, the reason for that is that when you write a function, all you're doing is making that function exist. You're providing that functionality to your script, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're using it. So here, even though I've created this say hello function, I have not actually called it in any way. To call a function in PHP is very much like to call a function in any other language. I simply use the function's name, spelled correctly. I put the parentheses in after the function's name. If any values were being given to the function, those would be filled there into those parentheses. This is then called a function call. This is where I'm actually asking PHP to activate my function. Once I put that in there, if I jump back to the browser and refresh, you can see we actually do have a hello that shows up at that point. The hello is technically showing up at the same point that my function call took place. What happens if I try to call my function up here before the function is actually written? If I put in another function call here before the function itself, go to the browser and run that, you can see that that also works just fine. PHP does sort of a pre-evaluation of our code. We've talked previously about how it actually goes through and converts all the non-PHP in the PHP file into PHP statements, effectively something like an echo statement. Well, it also works on functions a bit during that time, in that when it's converting everything over to PHP, if it sees that a function exists, then that function becomes available but doesn't actually run it yet on sort of a second pass through when it then sees our actual function call calls, it already knows about our functions and is able to execute them at that point, even if the function has not technically, in sort of a linear sense, actually been defined yet. Despite the fact that PHP technically does allow us to call functions before we actually write the function itself, that is pretty much never actually done. It's confusing and it's more difficult for somebody who's trying to read the code. It's almost always a better idea to go ahead and define your functions first and then call them after. As a matter of fact, something that very commonly is done is that we would create an entirely separate PHP block, potentially, maybe up at the top of our document, where we would define our functions, which could then be called later in the document whenever they actually happen to be needed. So what we have here then is a very simple PHP function. This particular function doesn't really do much. Obviously, it's just echoing out the string hello. Functions in PHP, like in most languages, get more interesting when we begin to interact with them a little bit more. Certainly, two of the most common types of interactions we would have with functions would be providing data to them and getting data back from them again. As I mentioned before, anytime we want to pass data to a PHP function, we do that by providing that data as an argument to the function itself. Essentially, when we call the function, we give it the data that we want to pass. Let's say here that I wanted to pass my say hello function a person's name, and that's who I want it to say hello to. So here on my first call for say hello, let me put in a name as a string. I'll have it call my friend Victrola. If I'm going to pass data to my function, then in the function itself I need to provide a way for that data to be received. I do that by putting a variable inside the parentheses following the function name. So here I'll create a new variable called name, and of course the way it will work is that whenever I call the say hello function, any value that's passed to that function will be stored up here in that variable. So Victrola will become the value of the name variable while this function is executing. I'll then be able to take and use that variable here inside the function itself. So I'll interpolate in the name variable into the string that's being generated there by echo. When I actually call my functions down here below, I can of course pass literal values to my function, but I could also potentially pass variable values. If I were to have a variable, for example, called person, and I had another name in that one, the name Purdy, then I could pass the person variable to the function. The value of the person variable is what would then be passed up here to the function itself. It's important to note that it's not the person variable itself that's passed, it's a copy of the value of that variable. So a copy of the person variable's value, a copy of the string Purdy, will be passed to the say hello function stored in the name variable and then used when the function is actually executed. So here I'm calling a function and I'm passing it a person's name. Here I'm calling a function and I'm passing it a person's name in the form of a variable. Let's look at that in the browser. And everything looks like it's working the way it should. I'm getting hello Victrola and hello Purdy. If I wanted to, I could pass multiple values to each one of the different functions. If instead of just passing a name, I also wanted to provide it with the number of times that I wanted it to say hello. Say, for example, I wanted it to say hello to Victrola 3 times. I might want to pass that extra number, let's say 3. I could then provide another variable up here in my function to accept that value. And then in the function itself, I could make use of it. Maybe I'll put in a regular old for loop, a good old-fashioned counter-controlled for loop, which I don't think we've actually used for a while. I'll set up a counter variable called I. I'll initialize that to 0. And I'll say as long as my counter variable I is less than the number of times, which is the variable that's being passed, I'll increment I on each one of those passes through. So whatever the value of times is will become how many times we actually say hello. So down here for Victrola, I've told it specifically I want it to say hello 3 times. That should work just fine. What about down here with person? What if I didn't want to specify a number of times? Maybe I would like there, for example, to be a default. PHP actually allows us to do that in that when we define our function, we can pass or we can assign a default value to a variable in it. So if up here in the function definition itself I put in $times equals 1, what will happen is that when I actually call my function and I do pass it a number of times, like when I'm saying hello to Victrola, I pass it a 3, the 3 sort of trumps the 1, and 3 will become the value of the times variable. The equals 1 will be ignored because a better value has already been used. When I call say hello the second time though, and I pass it the person variable with the name Purdy in it, that time I don't give it a number. So what will happen is since no other number is supplied, it will go ahead and use the default that I've provided here, and it will use the number 1. So my say hello function at that point, I can tell it how many times to say hello, and if I don't tell it how many times to say hello, it will say hello one time. Let's look in the browser and see how that works. Just like we would expect, I got hello Victrola 3 times and hello Purdy only once. It's very handy to be able to pass these default values or to be able to set these default values for the arguments in our PHP functions. One thing you want to be aware of when you're using them, though, is that anytime you set a default value, that always has to be the rightmost of the arguments. So I have name here as the first argument and times as the second. I'm calling times the rightmost. This last argument, times, can have a default set. Name could have a default set, but I couldn't set a default for name unless times also had a default. If you think about PHP trying to decipher where to put the different values that are being put into our different argument variables, I think that will kind of make sense. For example, here when I call say hello and I just give it person, how would it know that person belongs in the name variable and not in the times variable if I had set a default for name but not for times? So you have to be a little bit careful of the order that you put them in. Just the general rule of thumb is any optional arguments, any optional data that's going to have a default value assigned, just make sure that's the last argument passed. If there's going to be more than one optional, just make sure that more than one optional is going to be the last several of the arguments that are actually passed to the function. As long as you follow that rule, it stays pretty easy. Nothing too complicated there, really, if you think about it. Probably the next most interesting thing that we might do with functions in PHP would be to actually have them return values. Any value that a PHP function actually generates and then needs to provide back to whoever it is that called the function, that can actually be accomplished by using the keyword return. With the keyword return, we can use it all by itself, just return all with nothing else going along with it. That will simply cause the function to stop executing at that point. Even if there was other code after that return keyword, that other code would never execute. Return always means the function ends here. The way return is usually used, however, is to actually store values or to return values back, usually in the form of a variable. So here in my function, let me create a new variable. I'm going to call it output, and I'm going to start it off just as a blank string. And maybe what I'll do then is here in my function, instead of actually having the function itself echo the hello strings that are being put together, maybe I'll put those hello strings into my output variable instead. So to my output variable, I'm just going to append whatever output strings it is I'm putting together. At the end of the function then, when the function is complete, I could then at that point have it actually return that output. So whatever is stored in the output variable ends up being given back to whoever called it. Whoever's calling it are these two lines of statements right here, so that's the point where I would then need to be aware of what is being returned. Before I do anything with it, let me just jump over to the browser and see what's happening real quick. At that point, you see all of our hello strings have disappeared. In this case, they disappeared not because we're not calling our say hello function. We are calling it still twice. It's also not that the hello function isn't working. It is working. It's working just fine, just the way we've written it. The reason all our hello strings disappeared was because we're returning what is supposed to be the output from the say hello function in the output variable, but down here we're not actually then doing anything with those values. If I were to take the values that were being returned in those two lines and were to actually do something with them, we could get our output back again. So here when I call my first say hello function, maybe I'll take the value that's being returned and I'll assign it over here to a new variable. I'll call it returned value. I could then do something like say echo, the returned value is, and then I'll put in my returned value right there. Down here with my second echo statement, or my second say hello call, maybe what I'll do there is I'll just plain say immediately echo whatever it is that's being returned by that function. Let's look at that in the browser again. There we are. We're back to very much something like what we had before. I have my extra text in there, the return value is, and then 3 hellos for Victrola, and then 1 hello still down there for Purdy. Of course, the way that's actually working is when I'm calling say hello for Victrola 3 times, my function executes, it builds up a bit of output, it then returns that output, which is stored here in the returned value variable. I then echo out that returned value variable along with the rest of that string. With say hello for person, I call say hello and I pass it person, which is purdy. I don't give it a number of times, so of course my function executes. It again puts together the output variable. The output variable is returned, and when it's returned, it then immediately becomes an argument, becomes the value that's being given here to the echo statement. So the echo immediately just prints out, outputs, whatever value it was that was returned by say hello. And everything looks good. So hopefully, so far at this point, functions in PHP look roughly familiar to functions that you've probably seen before. The actual way that they're written certainly resembles the way that they're written in JavaScript using the keyword function to start them. The rest of the format's then fairly similar. The style of PHP variables is of course a bit different than the style of JavaScript variables, but the idea is the same. The ability to assign these defaults to variables is kind of a neat special trick that PHP functions have. But other than that, hopefully there's nothing here that's absolutely surprising in any particular way. There are a few things, or at least one. Let's say there's at least one really interesting sort of aspect of functions in PHP, and that aspect has to do with scope. PHP is sort of an unusual language when it comes to scope in a number of different ways. And when I talk about scope, what I'm essentially referring to is the range of code over which a particular variable can be recognized, can be used, if you want to think of it that way. So if I create a variable in a particular place in a program, that place where I create that variable defines the variable's scope. It'll define where in that program that particular variable can be used. For example, if I were to create a new function for myself, I think I'll come down here below where I'm doing my say hello stuff and let me start a new little section so that we can play with this scope. I'm going to echo a horizontal rule so the output on my browser will be separated from the name stuff down here to the scope talk we're doing. And here let me create a new function. I'm just going to call this new function show something, and I'll just start it off as a simple function that doesn't do much of anything at this point. And what I want to do is inside that function let me create a new variable. I'll just call the variable x and I'll give it the value of 9. After that function has done its thing, which apparently is just creating a variable called x and assigning it a value, what I want to do is I want to call my function again, or call my function I guess for the first time for this one, and then I want to see if I can access the value of my x variable. So I'll just echo x is and then the value of x. The kind of layman's thinking being that I call show something, which causes the x variable to be created, so I should then be able to access the x variable. Now, those experienced programmers amongst you know that that's certainly not going to work. If I jump back to my browser and I hit refresh, I get a notice. I have an undefined variable x on line 43. That's here in the echo statement where I'm trying to echo the value of x. And of course, the reason for that is scope, what we were just talking about. The issue is where I created x here inside this function means that x is only in scope inside that function. So x only exists while this function is actually executing. So during the brief little bit of time that this function is running, there is an x variable that has this value, but once that function is complete, essentially once this call is done, x at that point no longer exists, so I can't actually echo it out here. That's a pretty rudimentary example of how scope works, but there is something about scope in PHP that's a little bit odd. Here's what I'm going to do is before my show something function, I'm going to create another variable. I'm going to call it y, and I'm going to give it a value of 11. So I've created a value called y. I've given it a value of 11. If I were to come down and do something like I was doing a minute ago with x, but instead of displaying x, I'm going to instead display y. If I take a look at that in my browser, that of course works. Y is 11. Here I'm creating y outside of a function and I'm using y outside of that function, so that doesn't present any kind of issue. That works just fine. But what about accessing y inside the function? If I take the same echo statement I was doing outside the function, copy it to inside the function, and I'm just going to have it say y inside the function is, if I run that, that causes another notice, undefined variable y. Now this is a little bit unusual compared to a lot of languages. In a lot of languages that we deal with, we generally have effectively two scopes, something like a global and something like a local scope. Any variable created outside a function would be in the global scope. Anything created inside the function would be in the local scope. And in most languages, what happens is local scope is able to see global scope. But PHP's rules for scope are much more complicated, much more convoluted than you see in most languages. PHP doesn't just have 2 scopes, it has something more like 9, last time I tried to count them all. Don't worry, I'm not going to drag you through every one of them, but the 2 that are certainly going to be most important to us are going to be page scope and function scope. Function scope is essentially what we're in whenever we're inside a function. Page scope is effectively what we're in when we're not inside a function. And the interesting thing about PHP is even though those could be seen as being sort of a global and a local, they do not behave that way. Anything created in page scope is not automatically recognizable inside function scope. So here, when I create my y variable outside of a function, most people's programming instincts would tell them that that variable should then be available inside the function, but in PHP that simply isn't true. The only way to get a value to be accessible inside a function in PHP is to pass it. That's really the only option. So if I want my showSomething function to be able to use the value of y, then I have to really come up with some way to be able to pass the value of y to that function. If any of you have read ahead or are more familiar with PHP than you're letting on, then you might know there are a few other tricks that are possible, but trying to stick here basically to a couple good sort of concrete scopes without doing anything like stepping out to the global or the super global levels, overall I think encourages better programming practices. So I don't really want to go into any of the weird sort of side tricks that could potentially be used to get around this rule. Overall, I would say that PHP's way of doing it, basically saying, hey, if a function needs to use a value, pass that value, I don't really think that's harmful. I think actually in a lot of ways that's probably a pretty beneficial practice. In a lot of languages, people are sort of encouraged to set their programs up that way, but since the language itself doesn't actually force it, a lot of people end up being a little bit lazy and kind of avoiding passing whenever they can. But here in PHP, it's much more forceful about trying to make sure that values are passed into function scope if they're going to be used. And I think that's a good thing. It's a good habit to be in, so we should probably follow PHP's lead when it comes to that. All right, one more fun little thing that we can do here with functions in PHP. I'm going to throw in one more horizontal rule, again, just to keep our output a little bit separated. Let me scoop my code up a bit on the page so you can see it easier. Let's create another function in here. I'm going to call this function add10, and I'm going to say that this function is going to be passed a number. What I want this function to then do is simply to add 10 to that number and make that the number's new value. So num equals num plus 10. All right, when I call this function, let me create a variable for myself. I'll call it value, and maybe I'll give it the value of 9. If that's not too confusing, the val variable with the value of 9. What I want to do then is I want to call my add10 function. I want to pass it my val variable. And then the big question with this one becomes, after we return from the function, what will the value of the val variable be? If I say val after the function is, what will the value of the val variable actually be at this point? Will it still be 9? Because 9 was the last value that val was set to in this scope? Or will it be 19 because we passed val over to a function which then added 10 to the previous value, made that the new value, and then that would be the value that's left over down here? Do you have any guesses? Well, if you guessed that our value would be 9, still you were correct. What actually happened is something that I mentioned before. Whenever we pass a variable to a function, like I'm passing my val variable to my add10 function here, it's not actually the variable itself that's being passed. Instead, it's a copy of the value of that variable that's being passed. So when we apparently pass val to our add10 function here, we're not really passing the val variable at all. What we're actually doing is we're passing a copy of the value. We're just passing the number 9. So a new variable is actually being created when I call this function. The new variable is called num, and it is assigned that copy of the value. So there's a num variable that exists that has a 9 in it, and there's a val variable that exists that has the number 9 in it. Here inside the function, when I add 10, what I'm actually adding 10 to is the num variable. At that point, nothing is being done with the val variable. The val variable is still just sitting there. Nothing happens to it at all. I change my num variable, but then when my function ends, the num variable goes out of scope, which basically means it disappears. It goes away, never to be seen again. The val variable the whole time has just been sitting there with its net value of 9 in it. So when I echo out the value of the val variable, 9 of course is what I actually get. There it is down at the bottom. What if I actually wanted the value of the val variable to change? Well, there's a couple of different ways I could potentially make that happen. One of them would be by returning and assigning a new value. Inside my add10 function, when it was complete, I could ask it to return the value of the num variable, and then down here when I call my function, I could take the returned value and I could assign that to the val variable. At that point, technically, the add10 function is still not really changing the value of the val variable. Instead, the value of the val variable simply is made equal to the value of the num variable just before the num variable goes away, when the num variable here is being returned. That will work if I check it out in the browser. You can see now val is coming up as 19. And that's a fine way to do it. It's straightforward, it's easy to read, it ought to be pretty simple for everyone to understand. The only potential downsides of getting a function to change a global value at that point is what if I needed to return something else from this function? If this function's business was to produce several different values, num here just being one of them, I could run into a potential trick there in that the return statement can only return a single thing, a single value, whatever that happens to be. You can cheat that a little bit technically by returning an array, but still functionally the return statement can only return one thing. So there is one other trick that I could potentially do if I wanted a function to be able to change a global value. I'm just going to reset everything back here to the way it was before, where the val variable itself is not actually being changed. If I take a look in the browser just to confirm, yep, the val variable is back to just being 9 again. If I come up to my add10 function here, I can now implement this other way of doing it. What I can do is I can simply put in an ampersand character in front of the name of my variable here in the function definition itself, so ampersand $num. I believe we talked about in a previous video, or at least mentioned offhand, the ampersand operator in PHP. The ampersand operator in PHP is called the reference operator, and essentially when you put it in front of a variable, what it indicates is that you're not talking about that variable's value, but you're talking about the variable itself. So the difference that is going to make here is that when we call the add10 function and we pass it val, because of the use of the reference operator here, essentially what happens is PHP understands that instead of passing a copy of the value of a variable, we're passing the variable itself. So instead of val being a variable and num being a variable, two separate variables who have copies of each other's values, because of the ampersand, what happens here while the add10 function is running is that the val and the num variables are actually the same variable. It's just two different names for it existing in different scopes. In the page scope, my variable, which is just a spot in memory, is called val. Inside the function, that same spot in memory is called num. So whenever anything happens to either of those two variables, the same thing is mirrored in the other, apparently. And that's the way it looks. In truth, they're the same variable. When I actually add 10 to the value of the num variable here, you can think of num as being val. Num and val are the exact same thing. So it's actually the val variable that's being changed here, if you want to think of it that way, since val and num are actually the exact same thing. So here with just that ampersand being added to my function, if I jump back to the browser and take a look, you can see that we're back to getting 19 again. So instead of passing a value into my function at this point, I'm passing a variable itself to be changed. The function is changing the variable itself, which then alleviates me of the need of needing to actually return a value to then be reassigned to that variable. Now, this way is a bit more concise. The other way that I did it before, I had to return, I had to assign a value that was being returned. It was a little bit more work. Overall, though, I would actually say the first way is probably the better way, simply for readability's sake, less likely to confuse anybody. Here with the ampersand, it certainly is a very concise, almost elegant way to be able to handle this sort of problem. I added this one little character and I took care of the whole issue. But still, references, the ampersand character, are much more confusing to most people, much more so than simply returning and assigning would be. So I would say even though it is short, quick, and easy, it does add a certain level of complexity to the code that isn't necessarily required in all cases. So something you can use when you need to, but maybe not something to use every time or all the time. So hopefully at this point you've seen that functions in PHP are really not all that much different than functions you've probably seen in other languages. I hope they feel at least a little bit familiar to you. Functions in PHP are fantastic. They have lots of nice features to them, most of the things you see in regular languages. Plus, we have things like the ability to be able to create default arguments or assign default values to our arguments, like we did up here with the times variable for our say hello function. You do have to, of course, watch out in PHP for the scope issues. They do often catch people off guard since they're a little bit different than what we see in a lot of languages. And of course, there's always that reference operator, which is most commonly used with functions. So keep an eye out for that one and remember what it actually means when you see it. Functions are one of the ways that PHP gives us to be able to reuse our code. Generally, the best functions in PHP, like in any languages, are not necessarily short functions, but functions that are focused on doing a single thing. Whenever you write a function, it's usually best that that function does one task and does that one task well. A function that does one job will be much more valuable, much more reusable in the long run than a function that does two or more jobs. You could say, for example, which function would you be able to use more? A function that adds two numbers together or a function that adds two numbers together and then subtracts one? Well, there's going to in life be a lot more cases where I need to add two numbers together than there will be cases where I need to add two numbers together and then subtract one. So by making the function focused, only do the minimal job that's necessary, that function becomes something that I'll be able to reuse more and more times in the future. And that was, after all, the whole point in using these functions. These functions give us a way to be able to reuse code that we have written so that we don't ever have to write it again, don't ever have to test it again, don't ever have to debug it again. That lets us put our projects together, our programs together more quickly. It gives us more consistent results with less errors.